Siege of Tyre, 332 BC. Alexander the Great, documentary by Kings in General. Let's go.
Alexander wasted no time in enacting his peerless ambition. Not only had he eliminated his enemies at home and defeated the satraps of Asia Minor, but in 333 he confronted and crushed a Persian royal army at the Battle of Issus.
That he did.
With that victory, Midas's proverbial touch fell on the Macedonians and they began to drown in gold.
Okay.
But although Issus was a crushing victory, it was not decisive. Darius and the remnant of his army had escaped and would waste no time in drawing on the reserve manpower of his giant empire. Welcome to our video on Alexander's conquests and the siege of the island city of Tyre.
Come on then, let's go, Alexander.
Issus, Alexander couldn't heedlessly chase Darius deep into the Achaemenid heartland now.
No, of course
This
not. He
wouldn't
didn't want to risk
just
his
draw
supply
him into
lines.
an unknown hostile land
And
a possible guerrilla war, but would also leave behind potentially fatal issues in his rear. Much of the royal army's massive cavalry contingent had escaped north of the Taurus, where they were sure to wreak havoc on Macedonian supply and communication lines. Of even greater importance still was the Great King's Phoenician armada, which, under the command of satrap Pharnabazus, had renewed a campaign in the Aegean and now dominated most of it. So, while Darius began raising another army from his eastern provinces, Alexander decided to continue with his plan to take over Persia's naval bases.
Stop him from
A
having
few
that
days of rest after
advantage.
Issus, and the army was on the move once more, pressing south into Phoenicia. Following the surrender of Marathus, Alexander received envoys bearing an offer from Darius III.
What's this offer? What you got
If
for us?
Alexander restored to him his wife, mother and children, signed a treaty of alliance, and called off the invasion, he would cede all Asia Minor west of the Halys River, from Cilicia to Sinope to Macedon. If Philip's old guard, led by Parmenion, caught wind of this offer, they would argue that the invasion had achieved all its objectives. So Alexander omitted the offer of territory during his war council, and the proposal was rejected.
Nice.
It was in
He wanted
response that
everything.
Alexander penned his famous arrogant rebuttal. And in the future, let any communication you wish to make with me be addressed to the King of all Asia. Do not write to me as an equal. Everything you possess is now mine. So if you should want anything, let me know in the proper terms, or I shall take steps to deal with you as a criminal. If, on the other hand, you wish to dispute your throne, stand and fight for it, and do not run away. Wherever you may hide yourself, be sure I shall seek you out.
Oh my days, Alexander. Oh my days. You're literally just slapping him in the face and going, come and get it. Come and get it. Do you want it? No? Go away.
Alexander continued marching south, accepting the surrender of Phoenician cities such as Byblos and Sidon and the kings of Cyprus. Moving on even further south, the Macedonian army neared the mother city of Carthage, Tyre, at the turn of 332 BC. This most famous of Phoenician cities was composed of two separate segments. Old Tyre was on the mainland, while the primary, walled city of New Tyre had been constructed on a rocky island half a mile offshore. As Alexander approached the unique city, he was met by Tyrian dignitaries, among them the son of Tyre's king, Azemilchus, who, along with many other Phoenician rulers, was away at sea with the Persian navy. Their demeanor was respectful and hospitable, offering alliance, provisions, and gifts. However, they were not about to hand Tyre over to the Macedonians.
They wanted
In
their
response,
own little land.
Alexander expressed a desire to offer sacrifice at the Tyrian Great Temple within the island city itself. To allow Alexander to do this would essentially recognize him as Tyre's rightful overlord, so the envoys declined Alexander's request, offering the king to make sacrifice at an equally revered temple in Old Tyre.
And is he going to accept that or
Alexander
not? He's not.
exploded in anger, as he sometimes
He wants
would,
everything.
and dismissed the envoys with a threat that they should not be so confident in their island fortress, as it would soon be part of the mainland. Once the envoys returned home, they counseled the Tyrians to submit. However, buoyed by their formidable island fortress, its distance from the mainland, and the strength of their natural and constructed fortifications, the city decided to fight. If they hadn't been sure enough that this was the right path, a recently arrived delegation of Carthaginians began encouraging the people of their parent city to defend themselves, promising great reinforcement from their own city, which was a great naval power already.
Yeah, but it's not going to come
Despite
through,
his
is it?
anger, neither Alexander nor his soldiers were too enthusiastic about besieging the island city with a purely land army, as it would delay the campaign for a long time. The king's temper cooled, and he sent some envoys over the strait in order to urge the people of Tyre to accept peace terms. Possibly mistaking this as a sign of weakness, the Tyrians murdered Alexander's envoys and threw their
You've now
bodies
just
into the
forced
sea.
his hand.
The battle
You've
became
completely
inevitable.
forced his hand. Yep, he's now going to slap you
A great
about.
portion of the Macedonian officers and soldiers alike
Come
were
on,
daunted
Alexander, how
by
are you
the
going to do
staggering
this?
task ahead of them. But Alexander, in his typically daring manner, had a plan in his head that just might work. He really would make island Tyre part of the mainland. To enact his scheme, the king had old Tyre torn down and harvested its stone as raw material.
And he's going to make a
At the same
bridge?
time, parties were dispatched inland to Bekaa Valley,
What's
where
he
they
doing?
fetched timber from the cedar trees on the mountain
Or
slopes
is he just making ships?
to supplement the hardy men of the Macedonian army. Entire populations of nearby towns and cities were drafted to serve as a labor corps, which supposedly totaled many tens of thousands strong. Now possessing the material and the men to
He's
use
literally
it,
making a
Alexander
bridge.
began slowly constructing a 200-foot wide mole from the mainland across to Tyre, where it would connect just south of the Sidonian harbour. The king's engineers would sink wooden piles into the mud, pack stone between them to serve as a foundation, and then lay massive timber beams to complete the work. In the muddy terrain and shallow water adjacent to the shore, the going was relatively easy, and the mole's construction got underway with haste. Alexander was constantly present at the forefront of the effort, precisely instructing his workers how to proceed, motivating them with words of encouragement, and even
Like a
handing
good
out
commander
rewards for
should.
men who had particularly impressed him with their skill and gusto on the job. The Tyrians, initially believing the mole to be some kind of joke, rode out and mocked Alexander, jeering and asking the king if he thought himself greater than Poseidon.
He
The
was...
Macedonian efforts were so disconcertingly effective, and the work was being enacted in such efficient time, however, that the people of Tyre quickly changed their attitude.
realizing that,
Some
oh
of the
shit,
city's
this is
women and
about to
children were
work.
evacuated by sea. The Tyrian fleet was made ready, and the defenders began constructing extra artillery pieces in anticipation of a proper fight in the very near future. Trouble began for Alexander's besieging army when the mole reached deeper water, taking the construction near missile range. Aiming to stop Alexander's effort in its tracks, Tyre dispatched a squadron of skiffs to each side of the mole. Near unopposed on the sea, and loaded with missile troops and light catapults, these skirmishing vessels darted in close and unleashed a focused crossfire into the mass labor corps working on the land bridge. The draftees, along with Alexander's soldiers, who worked without their usual armor, suffered terrible casualties in this initial naval sortie, and were unable to continue working. To counter this kind of attack, a series of hide and canvas screens were rigged to serve as a barrier against arrow fire, allowing the workers to resume. 2 siege towers were also constructed at the end of the mole to allow Alexander's own missile troops a platform from which to respond.
Okay, sweet.
Difficulties now began increasing.
He was able to get
sides,
them
and
like
with
sort
that
of erect
difficulty
at the
came
right time,
superstition.
in enough time.
Rumors of ill portent spread, of Macedonian ration bread leaking blood, Tyrian defenders having visions of Apollo, and it is even said a great ocean leviathan smashed into the mole before swimming away again.
We all know that's bollocks. A cool
Next,
story.
to counter this latest stroke, the Tyrians brought forward a large transport ship and loaded it to the brim with brushwood, pitch, sulfur, and other fiercely burning materials.
Will work.
This fire ship was towed in the mole's direction by a pair of Phoenician triremes, who then at the last moment peeled away and flung the makeshift floating bomb at Alexander's siege bridge like an ancient cruise missile.
Yeah, okay.
It struck the edge and burst into an oily, blazing inferno, severely damaging the mole.
I'm surprised it hasn't spread.
And killing a great many of the king's troops. At the same time, the Tyrians launched another sortie, this time landing swiftly on the beaches south of the mole and assailing the labourers who were in the process of ferrying stone from Old Tyre. Further inland, Alexander's timber supply from the mountains decreased as well, prompted by the raids by Arab tribes who inhabited the hinterland. Both of the resources needed to ford the strait and gain victory were being choked off. Something had to be done to rectify the situation. After directing his dependable lieutenants Perdiccas and Craterus to rebuild the mole even wider than before, with towers and artillery, Alexander departed with his usual strike force of favourites and rode north to Sidon in search of a fleet.
Alright. Right, what's Alexander gonna do? Let's go.
Clearly, so long as the Tyrians were masters of the sea, the Siege of Tyre would be no easy matter. It was during the king's short stay in Sidon that perhaps the greatest strategic bounty of the Issus campaign revealed itself, however delayed it might have been. Having defected from Darius's naval war after the great king's crushing defeat, the Phoenician rulers of Byblos and Aradus pledged their sea-borne strength to Alexander.
Nice.
Together
so he's getting reinforcements from the
around 80
sea.
high-quality vessels
Naval reinforcements.
with equally high-quality crews. Other scattered vessels sailed from Lycia, Macedon, Rhodes, and other places. More promising still, the kings of Cyprus, seeing which way the wind was blowing, brought 120 ships and added them to Alexander's growing armada a day later.
This is
While
good
the
for Alexander.
fleet was being brought up to snuff and armed with artillery, the king ventured out on a punitive expedition into the Bekaa Valley, where he successfully handled the Arab tribes who had been raiding his wood-gatherers. Plutarch tells us that during this venture, Alexander snuck up to one of the tribal campfires during the night and personally slew 2 Arab warriors there with a dagger.
Always getting in the mix of it.
Upon returning to Sidon, the king not only found the fleet ready for action, but 4,000 additional mercenaries at his command. With his new armada of loyal client kings and reinforcements in tow, Alexander sailed back to Tyre. Initially, the Tyrians arrayed slightly off the city to face the Macedonian attempt at sea, but this giant force was far more than they were prepared
get caught
for.
out?
Wisely, the Tyrian fleet withdrew to the safety of their harbours,
they get away.
which they blockaded with vessels. The balance of power was now firmly on Alexander's side.
Nice.
The Macedonian allied fleet spent the night sheltering near the mole, ready to deploy when the sun came up. As soon as it did, Alexander ordered the Phoenician contingent to blockade Tyre's southern Egyptian harbour, while sending the Cypriots to do the same at the northern Sidonian harbour, effectively neutralizing and reversing Tyre's previous dominance on the seas.
So they're now not able to do anything, and he can basically make this bridge.
Once more.
Or the mole.
Unfortunately for Alexander, a ferocious storm began before the mole was set to reach the walls. Rain hammered down from the sky in torrents,
raising the water level,
and
right?
The sea became rough. This turn of luck not only made it impossible to make further progress, but ravaged the existing structure, setting the construction back considerably. To remedy this,
what a shame.
The king had a number of massive uncut trees floated into position on the windward side of the mole, where they absorbed most of the impact. When the storm at last subsided, these wave breaks were built into the structure as bulwarks, and the damage was soon repaired and expanded upon, taking the Macedonian bridge into the missile range of the walls. Intent on giving his workmen cover for the final stretch, Alexander massed his available siege catapults and stone throwers on the edge of the mole. Together with the artillery-armed fleet, and supported by archers and slingers, they launched a withering bombardment against the Tyrian battlements, clearing the defenders from the walls. Although under immense pressure, the Tyrians held on with great tenacity, hanging up screens to break the force of Alexander's artillery and building wooden towers on their battlements. From these, Tyre's archers in the first place? Volley of fire arrows at the Macedonian vessels, while the citizens worked at terrific speed to repair any breaches. In some places that wasn't viable, so they constructed a number of secondary curtain walls to plug the gap.
Okay.
At day's end, the situation in the city was dire, but the defences opposite the mall still stood firm.
He's got into a ship.
Sailing around to the
So what's he
seaward
gonna do
side
now?
of Tyre in the dark of night, Alexander attempted to take the city while it was sleeping, but was foiled only by another short but violent storm and forced
What a
to
shame.
back.
That could have been sick.
The Tyrians' moment of breathing space to scatter large chunks of stone into the shallow water adjacent to the walls, making it incredibly difficult for Macedonian ships to get close. In a desperate maneuver, Tyre's inventors and engineers began devising strange weapons to repel the invaders, including a fire thrower that belched molten metal, barbed tridents, rope-cutting scythes, and even militarized fishing nets to ensnare any Macedonian escalade. This last-ditch attitude was exacerbated by bad news from abroad. 30 more Carthaginian emissaries arrived with words of encouragement, but they regretted to inform their mother city that aid would not in fact be arriving.
I knew they weren't going to help him. I fucking knew it. I knew it.
Alexander spent some time clearing the stones which had been dumped into the water, allowing his ships to once again get close to the walls. At the same time, following a final Herculean burst of industry, the mole stretching all the way from the Phoenician coast to Tyre finally connected. As Alexander had vowed to the envoys of Tyre months earlier, he really had made the island city part of the mainland.
Crazy.
The time for a full-scale attack had come.
As if he'd done that. What a fucking feat. What an amazing feat, Alexander. He literally made a bridge to connect the island to the mainland.
From the end of the mole and from the sea on
back in 332
massive
BC.
stones launched by catapults smashed into the walls of Tyre, gouging out huge portions of stone and sending it crashing onto the rocks and into the water below. Ballista bolts and archery fire raked the battlements, killing defenders.
That's it, you got to
and
surrender,
making
guys.
others duck
This is
for
going to be
cover.
terrible.
Under the cover of this bombardment, Alexander's infantry used boarding gangways and ladders to attempt an escalade that would finally take the defiant city. They put fierce pressure onto the Tyrians, who fought back ferociously in a conventional manner, but also used their mad inventions to turn the attackers away.
Ooh.
Especially mentioned for their effectiveness were a number of metal pots filled with sand and gravel, heated until it was glowing. This fine mixture was then tipped onto Alexander's advancing soldiers, where it sifted behind armor plates and burned into flesh. After a long struggle which yielded no real results except for brutal casualties, the king was once again forced to abandon the effort.
No, they survived. They kept their place.
Dejected and exhausted
They held
by
strong.
the long siege, both he and his companions were about to simply bypass Tyre completely and march on to Egypt. But Alexander held on, if only because giving up now would be costlier than doggedly soldiering on.
Of course.
His persistence was to be rewarded. As they themselves were now in a desperate situation, the Tyrian ships at the Sidonian harbour launched a massive naval sortie completely by surprise. As the crews were at rest, dozens of Macedonian allied Cypriot vessels were sunk in the initial attack, and for a moment it seemed as though the Tyrians were about to make a breakthrough.
But it all goes terribly wrong.
Alexander personally led a squadron of ships from the Egyptian harbour and cut off the overextended Tyrian squadron, destroying almost all of it and bottling the rest up in the harbour, from where they could now do nothing to hinder his efforts. The king's troops and ships followed up this success by first testing an area of wall near the northern harbour, but he was pushed away. From there, his forces turned to assault a section of the Tyrian walls just south of the southern harbour, which Alexander judged to be weak. Artillery went loose once more, and a breach was made.
Nice.
Rather than throwing everything into this action, the king launched a brief probing attack and then withdrew. He was, however, now sure that the Macedonians had found Tyre's soft underbelly. A further few days passed as Alexander rested his men in preparation for the final assault and waited for good weather to return. When the wind and sea quieted down on the third day, the Macedonian army boarded its assault vessels and launched a massive attack on the weakened southern area. artillery once again hammered the area, collapsing a breach that was then widened even further. Simultaneous attacks were made from the mole and by the fleets on both harbours in order to keep the Tyrians busy. When the main breach was wide enough, the men of the elite Hypaspis brigade and their valiant king strode through, closely followed by mighty Craterus and his battalion of the phalanx and others.
Nice, Alexander, showing your prowess once again.
Peril, the defenders of Tyre fought back doggedly, contesting the Macedonians for every step. The fighting was so brutal that Admetus, captain of the Hypaspists, was slain by an axe to the skull. But Alexander's men had done it at last, surmounting the broken walls, taking the battlements, and gaining a firm foothold in the city. At the same time, Phoenician and Cypriot squadrons penetrated both harbours and prompted the retreat of most remaining defenders on the walls to the city centre,
well, of course they had to retreat
by enemy soldiers. They ran and ran, pursued by the Macedonians until they reached the shrine of Aganar. There they fought a last stand and died almost to the last man. With the end of organised resistance, chaos broke out. At their king's command, Alexander's soldiers went on the kind of rampage that is so common after long, frustrating sieges. Peter Green paints a picture of the mood and the scene in those hours.
It is horrible, but it was just the times.
All restraint abandoned, hysterical and half crazy after the long rigours of that dreadful siege, mere butchers now, striking and trampling and tearing limb from limb, until Tyre became a bloody, reeking abattoir.
Literally become animals.
Only those who took shelter in Melkart's temple were spared. 7,000 soldiers and citizens were butchered in this sack, and a further 2,000 crucified by Alexander when the soldiers' fury died down. The casualty figures would have been far worse had the Sidonians not turned into unlikely heroes. Although entering the conquered, hated city of Tyre on Alexander's side, it is said that they, feeling the plight of their Phoenician cousins, hid 15,000 people and ferried them to safety at Sidon. Tyre, already aflame, was
nice. If that's true, I'm glad that they got out.
Utterly destroyed, and the remainder of its population was sold into slavery. When news of Tyre's end spread, almost every remaining city on the Mediterranean seaboard prepared to surrender, and Darius III, who had been keeping a close eye on the situation, sent even more favourable peace terms.
Yeah, but I hope they addressed Alexander how he should be.
Toward the kingdom of the Pharaohs.
Making his way down to Egypt.
Time passed and the elements took their course. Gradually, the rough edges and sharp joints of the Macedonian king's infamous mole, which so boldly connected Tyre to the mainland, softened.
Of course it did.
Sands gathered and winds blew, connecting Tyre permanently to the Asian mainland. Today, as Green tells us, deep under the asphalt streets and apartment blocks, the stone core of that fantastic causeway still stands, one of Alexander's most tangible and permanent legacies to prosperity. But
wait, so it actually didn't... Is that right? No. No way that's right. Is it actually still connected? I thought over time it would have stopped. That's so interesting. It expanded. Oh shit.
But the king wasn't finished writing his legacy yet, not even close, and more videos of Alexander's campaigns are on the way. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
And I hope you guys are, because I definitely am. If you haven't already, head over to his page. That link's in the description box down below, so you can subscribe and hit that notification bell for him. And if you enjoyed my reaction, looking forward to the rest of this Alexander series, then you know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I will catch you in the next video.